This is Photography 1, Honors Option Project Part 3. I did my project on Edward Weston, the famous photographer from the US. Edward Weston was born in Illinois in 1886. He lived there in Illinois and in the Chicago area until he was 21, when he then moved to California. There, he worked as a photographer for the rest of his life, coming and going, working in other places like Mexico, New Mexico, Arizona, things like that, but resided in California. And he also later died there in 1958 at the age of 71. Unfortunately, in the last 10 years of his life, Weston didn't actually photograph anything. He was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease in 1947, and this is when he stopped taking photographs. Over his lifetime, though, he produced almost 1,400 negatives, and of those 1,400 negatives, many of which became very popular and or famous. Now, although he didn't photograph anything in the last 10 years of his life, he did, in fact, continue to produce photographs. He spent those last 10 years overseeing the production and editing of his own works, and he actually produced almost over 1,000 more photos in his name. So Weston was world renowned for his photographs, and he excelled in areas such as still lifes, landscapes, nudes, and portraits, which you will see here. The first photograph I was going to talk about was Surf, which was taken in China at Point Lobos in 1938. So this is a still life of the ocean crashing over what appears to be the bottom of a cliff or rocks or something like that. And I found this picture to be very interesting because so much is going on, but at the same time, it's a very simple concept where it's the ocean, but there's so much going on that it's hard to really tell what's moving and what's not, and what the water is actually doing. And because it's black and white, it's kind of hard to tell, and he utilizes that to make it more complex, as well as the shadowing and other things like that. Because of the fact that it's so challenging to tell what's going on, it makes it captures the viewer's imagination, and it makes them think and continue to process and wonder what's actually going on, where you might think something's happening, but then after further evaluating it and looking at it more closely, you realize that it's not actually what it looks like. I think this makes this picture especially intriguing because of the fact that you don't really know what's happening until you really evaluate it. The next picture was Pepper, taken in 1930. This was a still taken by Weston that utilizes shadow and light exposure to emphasize and exemplify the shape and curvature of a misshapen bell pepper. And in theory, this wouldn't be a very interesting and intriguing photograph, but I found it to be kind of captivating because of the fact that it almost looks like a human being, given the correct angle and lighting and things like that. And this is only shown by the fact that he perfected his lighting and his exposure settings that emphasize the certain curves and shapes of the pepper, while making sure to capture the entirety of the pepper itself. And I found this to be intriguing as well, because your eye wants to follow along the curves and edges, and it makes the pepper in its entirety much more intriguing to look at. The next picture I was going to talk about was Shell, taken in 1927. This is yet another still done by Weston, where he takes a very irregular shaped shell and then puts an entire new spin on it, where he evaluates it from an entirely new angle that is not usually the most commonly viewed point of view when inspecting and looking at shells. And I think that this irregular angle with the irregular shape of the shell makes the picture even more intriguing, because it's a very uncommon shape for a shell, and then he also turns it in a way that you almost have a hard time telling what it actually is until you really, really look at it. And he again uses shadows and lighting to emphasize the curves and shapes of the shell, but make sure to encompass and capture the entirety of the shell, making it a really, really great still. The next photograph was a nude taken in 1927, and when I initially looked at this photograph, I actually thought it was a charcoal drawing and wasn't actually a photograph, because of the way that Weston lit the photograph. It was actually really hard to tell the difference. And I think that this photograph actually does a fantastic job exemplifying the shape and curves of the human body that are not always the most looked at. And it's his work does a fantastic job in shadowing and shading certain parts of the body to emphasize certain curves and lines, while making sure to not leave out any details, such as on the foot or the toes and the creases on the skin and things like that. And I think that because of the fact that he does such a good job showing everything, that this makes this picture so much deeper and more interesting. The next photograph I was going to show was a portrait called Galvin's Shooting, taken in 1924. And in this portrait, Weston utilizes directionally diffused light shown kind of onto the one side of the man's face to almost dramatize, and it emphasizes the points and the wrinkles and the curves on the man's face and ear and hair, and almost makes you take a step back and begin to wonder what he is actually looking at. You focus less on the photograph itself and more on what the man in the photograph is looking at, where you first think, oh, is he looking at a ship? Is he looking at a skyscraper? And it causes your mind to begin to wonder, because of how captivated and how focused the man is in the actual photograph. You wonder less about the photograph itself and more about what the man is actually seeing. And this is only done by the fact that he almost makes it look like as if you're standing right next to the man, and just perfectly how the sun is shining on the one side of his face, creating shadows on his forehead and on his mouth and in his eyes and things like that. And it makes it seem so much more lifelike if he were to have taken it in a studio or in a scenario where the lighting was better. And I think that that's what makes this photograph so great. The last photograph I was going to talk about was Cabbage Leaf, taken in 1931. And initially when I looked at this, I didn't actually think it was a cabbage leaf. I initially thought it was a scarf or a blanket or something kind of flapping and billowing in the wind, until I realized that it was actually a cabbage leaf, positioned just perfectly so that it looks almost like it's flowing and moving through the air. And he creates this effect not only because of the way that the cabbage is actually shaped and grown, but also through the lighting he uses, where he makes it look almost as if the sun is hitting just onto the one side of the cabbage, and it's moving almost. The way that he gets it to light up, it makes it look like the cabbage is in a perpetual movement and it can't stop. And the only way that he would have been able to do this in a real life scenario is if he was outside on a sunny day, but it was also very windy, to capture this very moment, had it been an actual scarf or blanket. And I think that this effect of movement is something that is very hard to actually achieve if you don't have the right lighting and if you don't have the right setting and things like that. And I think that he does a fantastic job encompassing and exemplifying this movement that I challenge anyone to find as good of an example of as this. That was the entirety of my part 3 of the honors option project. Thank you.